G'day from Dallas, Texas, legends. I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and so far you are having a fantastic week. Now, just to the beginning, I want to say a massive thank you for sticking with me over these past weeks while I have been traveling around the US. I know my production quality as well as some of my research isn't up to the usual standard, but I am back in a couple of days, back in the studio and back to more full-time work with this. But thank you very much. Look, for traveling around and doing very long hours driving. I drove yesterday all the way from Colorado Springs to Dallas in about 12 hours. I think we've done all right to pump out videos. Now, legends, today, as always, we have a lot to go over. And this is going to be a longer video because you're not going to see me for a couple of days because I live on literally the other side of the world. We're going to have a look at the maps. We have a lot of maps actually to go over. A couple of days, but then Suryak, he's catching up on a lot. As well as we're going to go through this crisis that is unfolding in Ukraine at the moment. And you don't see it just bubbling away at the moment, but more and more is coming out. And this is the way attritional warfare works. Attritional warfare is just pressure. That's all it is. And all warfare is, yes, it's a blunt instrument, but warfare is a tool of politics. War is politics by other means, Karl von Clausewitz. And if you can't do something diplomatically, well, often the last resort is then war. And attritional war and pressure economically, politically, militarily, eventually it starts to blossom into then crises in sectors. And we need to talk today about Zelensky's crisis that he's having as far as his own legitimacy and how this can actually be more of a issue for Ukraine than actually Russia pushing. That's where Russia may push to have actually and then compound and exploit into further success on the battlefield. Right, so or success on the battlefield to then exploit and garner then gains politically or by territory influencing politics by NATO, EU, etc. So we'll start at the maps and we'll talk about that. There's a lot to go over. We draw some conclusions. We look at doctrine, everything as well. So, of course, here we have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The red check today that you'll see on the map, that is ground that Russia has made over the last 24 hours. And you can see some of it from here, but we're not going to be concerned with today's 24 hours yet. We're going to go back to yesterday's 24 hours. Now, by the time you see this video, there may be a new map update out. And if you're watching this then outside of 17, 18, 19, well, skip forward to when we talk about the crises occurring. So let's zoom in and we'll come down onto the Velika Novosilikia front line where Russia is making further ground, both heading west and heading north. Let's hope my map can actually load here. So we see Pidubne heading out in this Voxgorenska as well north in the direction of Zeleny Hay. Just keep these in the back of your mind once we start showing you the Suryak maps. Then we step up into the most important sector of Pokrovsk. As well, Pokrovsk is becoming two sectors. It's not just Pokrovsk, it is also then Toretsk, as this double envelopment is occurring using then the same flank. Why is Pokrovsk important? Why are you being told that it's not important? Okay, I think it's Austria Intel, or whatever they refer to themselves as, is saying Pokrovsk is not important. And as soon as you hear those words of not strategically important, or however you'd like to remix those words, that's when you know this is very important. And we'll just stick here for a second. Why is Pokrovsk important? Well, let's have a look on Google Maps. Okay, so here we have Pokrovsk in the center. See all these highways, all these logistic routes, these main service routes heading in and out of here. It doesn't just feed into Pokrovsk, but it feeds out of here as well. So Ukraine can feed a lot in, but also if Russia gain this area, they can feed a lot out and use that as a hub. And this is where we've speculated about Pokrovsk. How much burden is Ukraine willing to have to to attempt to defend this area, because they can feed a lot into here. It's going to be at a large cost, because Russia's, of course, got these flanks, so these logistic routes are under some level of fire. This one is under fire control, so that can massively help in their goal of attrition using the I always call it the paint by numbers, but I forgot what they typically, the triple choke, where you hold in place, hit with fabs, blah, 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 to attrit down. And that's why this area is so important, feeding from Pokrovsk, Dobropilia, Pokrovsk into other areas in Donetsk. Don't listen to those who are saying that is not important. It's important both on the ground as far as tactical route movement as well and logistics, but it's also very important strategically as an area to hold and attrit as well. So let's then step up to today, and we'll see more red check. So let's start back down here, and we can see on this flank, the Pokrovsk and Toretsk flank, Russia is making some more ground around Romanivka, as well in Toretsk itself. Nothing down in the south. We'll jump onto there in a second, but we do have Russia making some ground in some different oblasts. So up in Kharkiv, they have made a small amount of ground here. These are alternate front lines. These aren't secondary axes. This is just to waste Ukrainian manpower up into these areas. In my opinion, it is just to, yep, we can come in, hold this. Ukraine need a large amount of force in case this becomes something. Same as Sumy, same as the other Vovchansk-Lipsy front lines. And what that does is that when Ukraine is suffering a manpower shortage crisis, well, it makes it thinner down in Pokrovsk. And then we have Sumy. We can see that Russia is making some more ground in this axis. Of course, this has slowed a lot, but again, at best, this is a secondary axis. It's definitely not a primary. I don't even really think it's a secondary. I think it is realistically just a buffer to hold troops up into here, as well as if there is some negotiated settlement. You know what Kursk was going to be used for? Russia can use it the same way as a swap back of territory. But that isn't where the story ends, because we know, of course, this map has had a lot of lag previously. It can help set that pseudo environment of what is occurring as well. It's linked in with the Ukrainian MOD. And when this map spoke out about that, well, allegedly they were threatened to be sent to the front line, which is something we're going to talk about later on, about the problems that this creates with then getting more personnel and the legitimacy of a government, why some are getting rich and some of their kids are over in Europe or in the EU. Meanwhile, those who can't afford to leave are on the front line, or those without YouTube channels. So let's come down into Pokrovsk. So here we have Pokrovsk, and we're going to be looking at Udashne today. So let's have a look at the first Syriac map from a couple of days ago. After the failure operations to enter Udashne, Russian army began since the beginning of July an operation to encircle the locality. And how often do we hear this? After the failure of Russia to break in straight away, well, you then envelop around it. Then we have a more recent update here. Some ground being made just into Udashne, very close to the deep state map here. And then we come down and just above Shevchenko, just some ground being made outside of the train line here. Again, grinding forward, focus on the flanks, but Russia's primary goal of Pokrovsk is attrition. And even if we don't see these flanks move for some time, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see this move at all, because it is enveloped. The Russians are 10 kilometers on the northern side of here. Maybe they'll push a little bit further in here, but again, we will see. But this could be catastrophic for attrition. Okay, so let's look at this Pokrovsk eastern flank, as well as how that's becoming Toretsk. So we'll look over both of these. So Syriac maps, he is showing, like the other maps been showing, and like this one is showing in grey zone. It's almost a rule of thumb. I'm not willing to have this as a rule, but very close to. It's like the rules-based order. We say it's a rule, but we don't actually do it. Is the grey zone on this map is somewhat the red zone. That time and time again, that's what we've seen. There's a lot of red zone that's not even shown as grey, but we see these two reservoirs in here, and just like the other map, Syriac is showing from Fyodorivka all the way just to the north of Krasny Liman is coming under Russian control. And then Step up to a more recent map, again showing just expansion of control in this sector. Again, you want to move and then fatten, move and then fatten. We've spoken about the desaturation that has, as well as movements in the direction of Poltavka, Rusan Yar, like the maps I showed you the other day were showing. And then we see further, exactly like we said, you move one way. So if you move north, you move east and west. You move north, move east and west. And if you move west, move north and south. And this is what we are seeing of this like crawling tactic working. So we see all from Mirobivkia, all through this sector that Russia is allegedly by Syriac map from basically here all the way down, bringing this under control, cementing that eastern flank, and then more ground being made on then the north of here all the way through this Novotoretsky and Fyodorivkia coming under control too, and more exploitation of this flank. And what this flank is, now that it's fat, it's not going to have the saturation of Ukrainian drones or artillery into here, so it'll be easier to bring things into the fold. The biggest weapon system that I'm waiting to see operate in Minograd Pokrovsk is once we see TOS, either 1, 2, or 3, that will tell us a lot about the situation and the movement of the Russian forces. But very dangerous to bring a weapon system like that into the fold at the moment. Let's have a look here. So this is still interconnected. And remember what I've been saying now for a couple of weeks is we are going to see axes start meeting and then exploit large kilometre square gains. So we can see there's definitely movement around then Torets, and you can see it's a little bit difficult just with some of the different labelling on this map, but movement in here is showing what Syriac has shown for some time, but movement up into Petrivkia, again, this is not showing the geolocations of Russian flags that we have seen, a movement of Ukrainian forces out of the pocket down in this sector. We can see where this reservoir is here to just sort of get an idea of where he's saying the front line is sitting. And then he has a second, more recent update saying the Torets city was clarified. Some areas taken by the Russian army at the beginning of June have been recaptured by the Ukrainian forces. So up in some of these sectors in here that have come, in some of these sectors in here coming back under Ukrainian control or were under Ukrainian control, and he's had to re-clarify the map. So let's then move our way. I'm going to go against all my typical order of here, but let's go into turn E, because this is what we keep talking about with the primary goal being attrition. And I'll show you in a second why attrition as a goal can influence internal relations and politics and decisions so much. And this is the turn E sector, and this is the threat, this is surrounded on 3 sides. The only way in and out of here, the only way is through this small gap in and around Karpivkia of about 12 kilometers. What do we know from Ukrainian sources themselves? Everything within 15 kilometers is getting absolutely shattered by drones. Russia will leave this open for that attrition. Ukraine may pull out of here, but it's going to be costly to pull out as well. So no movement being shown here, but what I've been saying is they'll only move to this western extreme, and then they'll try and expand this axis. And what do we see further and further on here? Sorry, I'm in the wrong bloody folder. Is we see around Herkivkia, up here, Russia expanding this area, and then again, next day, expanding that area. And we know exactly why you want to fatten areas to not be able to be not only cut off, but strategically vertically encircled as well, because that's what could happen here, is if this wasn't fat, is if Ukraine can have enough artillery from missiles, from drones, from whatever, can vertically envelop this. Now, that is why you want to fatten that, and that is ultimately one of Ukraine's biggest mistakes in Kursk, was actually not having it fat enough from that push up through Sudzha, and that's what we saw, that costly withdrawal occur. So we see that unfolding there. Let's continue our way up into the north, shall we? So there's a few different areas in here. We have Kupiansk, we have then the new crossing as well across then the waterway in here. So let's have a look. There's a fair bit going on. So of course we still have the deep state island boys of Kindrashivkia. They must be Sas, Mando, Delta, Grom, fucking everything without resupply for a month. So It must be doing a Bear Grylls drinking your own piss at this point in time, but movement in Radkadka and, of course, Kinja Shivkia. No major changes shown in here. We have just above this around Zapadne area, so, or maybe near Dovhenki, just some ground being made. Of course, Russia is still pushing across then the Oskil in this direction, and that's still, I don't really know where I put what the movements are there at the moment. And then we have this movement being made on this sort of different axes in here. And again, we see both maps showing close enough. We know there was definitely some movement. But then we had yesterday, or maybe not yesterday, maybe a few days ago, let's step back. I believe it was maybe the 16th, 17th. Maybe the map's pausing on me. But what we had was we did have ground, yes, right there. We did have this. We had this red zone in Vovchansk, and we did comment at the time, said we haven't seen that for some time. And now Suryak map, he's confirming this movement as well. So Russia making some ground in an area which has not moved for some time. Then the last area going to go is we have, of course, this ground being made in Sumy, but we need to come west of here, where Russia was basically surrounded at one point only a few weeks ago in Tyankhino, but it looks like it has cleared that, and according to Suryak maps, the Russians have been able to push the Ukrainian forces back to the border in here, according to Suryak maps at least. Now let's move our way down to Velika Novosilka. We're out of order at the moment, but that does not matter. Velika Novosilka, this grey zone from Murny through, I believe that is red. Wouldn't be surprised to see this move into the next month, so it doesn't show that kilometre squared that we are seeing at the moment. So let's have a look in around here. We do have a couple of different updates. So we have Zeleny Hay. Of course, this is the border here of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Now, what the which one is it? What the Suryak maps is showing is there's a lot more movement up from Yalta all the way to Zeleny Hay, all the way up to this border line. You can see why the front line looks so funny here. It's separated by natural waterway tree lines in there too, but it's showing more movement in the direction of Zeleny Hay, and then showing the same axes we saw. So you see how yesterday we saw this was red check. He's showing in this same axes, but more in line with how a war like this would work as far as that grinding forward is. You're not just going to have fingers coming out. You might have movement and then it expand. Otherwise, if you have this and this is going to get cut off immediately. So it does move up and then very quickly exploit into actual ground being made. So we see more ground being made there. And then Velika Novosilka, we see the last folder in here. We can see how this is exploiting onto then the Pokrovsk western flank, even in here around Dashne, Zeleny Kut, that's showing more movement than in these directions in here, as well as crossing into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast down around Dashne as well. So southwest of Hodorkove, pushing in Dashne, and again, in the future, we will see this then join that, and we're not sure exactly where the next development then may take place. So let's continue our way. We'll actually come down into the south, and where are we talking about in here? We're talking down and around Malinivka or Huliapol, where we have seen this moving confirmed by the maps. He's showing more Malinivka coming under control, in increasing that as well in the sector down and around here. Again, we've seen all maps confirming there has been Russian advancement in here. We then come up into Shasiv Yar, an area which is difficult to get an idea on exactly what is occurring, but we do know we've seen a lot of geolocations out here. Took full control over Stopochke, so saying the Russians control Stopochke down in this sector. And our last map update, we come into Siversk, an area where we see any movement should concern you, regardless of which way it is, because of how good the Ukrainian defense has been in here, to the point of, as I always say, we heard Russian commanders commenting on how good the defenses have been. So the reason we're not going to see Deep State move on this is they didn't show any of the Russian advancement in here. We have Verkhonomayansky coming under control of the Russian forces like over the last couple of weeks, then more control there, but Ukraine having counter pushes down this waterway, the reservoir in here, trying to push that back as well. And as we spoke about, the first indication for us was when Fabs were dropping on the outskirts of Siversk, and then we started seeing the map move in that direction. Again, I still think the primary sectors at the moment is Pokrovsk, for attrition, and the other sectors are drawing forces away and using, if an opportunity pops up, to take that opportunity to either attrit or make ground. So this is the article I want to go over. So we're going to go over this article. Actually, I've got a better screenshot of the article in here. So this article here, Ukrainians have lost faith in Zelensky, by Mr. Owen Matthews. The Spectator today is the one reporting this. But what I will say is many different articles like this have come out today. This is from the Spectator, but I've seen Financial Times, I've seen a lot of other media, bloggers, whatever, speaking about this loss of legitimacy or questions being asked of Zelensky. And I wanted to go through this, and then we're going to go through a full conclusion of bits and pieces, and then look back at some extending of Russia by Rand back in the day and see where so much of this is lining up with some of those predictions as well. Donald Trump this week boosted Ukraine's air defences with new Patriot batteries, threatened Vladimir Putin with sanctions if he does not agree to a ceasefire, and even reportedly gave tacit approval to more Ukrainian strikes on Moscow. Trump's newfound support for Ukraine is a welcome lifeline. The question is whether his help will be enough to stop Russia's relentless attacks before Ukraine is engulfed in a critical military, political and social crisis that threatens to destroy it from within. But again, all of this is only defensive weapons. Nothing on this can seize and hold terrain. Men have to do that. Putin chose war over peace this spring because his spies and generals told him that Ukraine is on the brink of collapse. And as we said, they could smell blood in the water, and you don't need to be a spy or a military general to take a look at the maps and see what is occurring and go, you will likely be in a better position in 6 months than you are today. And that is simply objectively correct as far as a battlefield and movements for negotiations, for political influence down the line. You don't need to be a general to see that, but you won't see it if you're a propagandist monetizing this online. Alarmingly, they may be right. Ukraine is running out of fighting men, its frontline soldiers are exhausted, and US military support has narrowed to focus on air defense. Air defense can't win wars. The Kyiv government is racked by corruption scandals and purges. Public faith in their future and in their leaders is tanking, and pressure to make peace at almost any price is growing. And we see a lot of purges in the Ukrainian government at the moment. And what I'll say with this is you always pay the piper. That it can be ignored for some time. You could ignore corruption, you could ignore scandals, you can ignore the front line even. But eventually, you will pay the piper. And war doesn't improve corruption at all. Not when there's billions flowing in. Nor does it improve scandals, and nor does it take away extreme elements. It makes a lot of that significantly worse. In many ways, the most remarkable thing about the conflict is that Ukraine still fights on despite the merciless and titanic punishment that Russia has meted on its soldiers, civilians and infrastructure. Yes, it is unbelievable. Ukraine continues still fighting. Why? Because these people, the ones who are actually fighting, the ones who can't afford or have the honour not to flee into Europe, they know if they don't win, if they don't get the best possible success or outcome in this, they don't know what then happens. They're trying to take their future into their hands. They don't have the money to move into Switzerland and live in a villa. If the war continues soon, there will be no Ukraine left to fight, from one former senior official in Zelensky's administration. They now believe their former boss is prolonging the war to hold on to power. Even once staunch pro-Zelensky cheerleaders such as Maria Belinskaya, head of Aerial Reconnaissance Support Centre, a prominent Ukrainian volunteer movement, expresses despair, saying, "We're hanging over the abyss. Ukraine is an expendable pawn in an American game. Trump, Putin, Xi will spend us like small change if they need to." Now let's come back to Zelensky too in a second when we have a look at a conclusion in here. That extending Russia will drive up Russian costs, but it will increase the loss of Ukrainian lives and territory, and potentially a disadvantageous peace settlement for the extension and the pros that that extension of another country may give for your influence in that sector of the world. Ukrainian morale, admirably high for much of the war, is collapsing. Back in October 22, even after 6 months of violence and bloodshed, 88% of Ukrainians believed that that they would be a flourishing country inside the EU. Of course, after you had those successes of Kharkiv, Kherson, and the promises of the 23 counteroffensive and the promises of the capability of Western weapons and Western training, and roll into Crimea having a party with the boys looking for chicks. We know that never occurred. Now 47% think that Ukraine will be a depopulated country with a ruined economy. A separate survey found that 70% of Ukrainians also believe their leaders are using the war to enrich themselves. Nothing is more corrosive to wartime morale than the idea that a nation's leaders are stealing as its people fight and die. Corruption kills and loses wars. This is from the former head of Ukraine's central bank, who is in exile in Austria after being charged with corruption in 2023. In recent weeks, Ukraine has been engulfed in corruption scandals. 2 deputy prime ministers, Minister for National Unity and Minister for Reconstruction have been investigated for embezzlement and treason. Zelensky has repeatedly tried to sack Major General Kirill Budanov. We've seen him, of course, sack Zaluzhny for the same reason. Budanov, of course, is the head of intelligence, and he's growing in popularity. We saw Zaluzhny, who was correct, whether you like Zaluzhny or not, whether you've seen the photographs of legitimate Nazis on a desk or not, it doesn't matter. So what I'm saying is he was right when he said we need 500,000 guys, we need this, blah, 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 blah. And he was growing in popularity as a very likable person for a lot of people, and Zelensky sacked him. Only pressure from the US Embassy in Kiev prevented the sacking of one of Ukraine's most popular generals, Budanov. A serving senior European diplomat with knowledge of the case tells me. How sovereign and independent. The recent spate of arrests and searches against Zelensky loyalists suggests serious political infighting at the heart of the Kiev government, and also a reckless readiness to take down prominent critics both inside and outside the state, regardless of how it looks to the outside world. It doesn't matter how it looks to the outside world because we're not shown it, because it will be covered up by the bloggers, by the media, by the governments. Perhaps the most shocking of all recent arrests is Vitaly Shubanin, one of Ukraine's most prominent anti-corruption activists who has been charged with evading military service and fraud. The chair of the Anti-Corruption Action Centre Executive Board and leading watchdog military corruption attacked the government soon after his arrest, saying taking advantage of the war, Volodymyr Zelensky is taking the first but confident steps towards corruption and authoritarianism. This gentleman has been a critic of a proposed law on defence procurement that would allow the Defence Ministry to exempt chosen companies implementing government contracts from criminal liability. So if you implement these contracts, you're exempt from criminal liability, much like when major pharmaceutical companies implant something and sometimes you have to have it and you're exempt from criminal liability. We've seen how that ends. At the same time, the administration has blocked the appointment of new independent head of the Bureau of Economic Security, a powerful law enforcement agency with uncomfortable track record of persecuting Zelensky political opponents. Number 5, Ukraine has 2 enemies, 2 Vladimirs, Zelensky and Putin, from a former Ukrainian cabinet minister and once a strong supporter of Zelensky. He says Putin is destroying Ukraine from the outside, but Zelensky is destroying it from within by destroying its will to fight and its morale. Again, let's stick on this for a second. Destroying from the outside and destroying from within. I believe it is in one of my final conclusions in this. Nations don't lose wars because they run out of bullets. They run out of belief. The goal isn't to win quickly for attritional war. It's to make your enemy rot from the inside out. Human rights are being trampled on. There is pressure against political opponents. Rich and influential people who could support opposition are being expropriated, and opposition media is silenced. And the irony is the Putinification of Ukraine is being funded by the West. Under the terms of a wartime state of emergency, more than 5,000 Ukrainians have come under sanctions and had their property frozen. The measure first invented to prevent Russian-controlled politicians, media groups and oligarchs from influencing Ukrainian politics and democratic. It is now widely used to silence opponents of the regime, says critics, as well as police the media. Sanctions have led to the closure of 3 YouTube channels belonging to Zelensky critics in the past month. We've seen YouTube channels shut down, and of course we see on the other side, we see a lot of bots boosting a lot of other channels. Censorship often shields authoritarian leaders, and unchecked power breeds dictatorship. And this is why you have opposition, is to try and check that power and not just be a self-confirming prophecy for time. Meanwhile, resentment, resistance, and anger are rising at aggressive measures taken by the authorities and press gang military-age men into the army. We see a lot of recruitment at the moment saying, and basically threatening, going, well, you're going to be called up anyway. We will find you, so join us before we do. A process known as bussification. Unlike the Russian army, which is made up of contract soldiers, Ukraine has instituted a full mobilisation of men over 26 not engaged in vital civilian work. And again and again and again, you'll see these room temperature IQ propagandists talking about Russian conscription and have completely no idea of the makeup of the front line between contract and conscription of the forces we're seeing. Ukraine's social media is filled with daily videos of men being bundled into vans by recruitment officers, sometimes at gunpoint. And sometimes following that, we've seen cases go through at recruitment centres of torture, sexual harassment or sexual assault, all of this, and murder as well. Yet many of those forcibly recruited seem to have little desire to fight. The Australian military, World War I, spoke about this, but we don't want guys who are conscripted because where's the desire to fight? In the first 6 months of this year, Ukraine's prosecutor's office reported that it opened 107,672 new criminal cases of desertion. Since 2022, 230,804 such criminal cases have been instigated. Again, this number is lower than it actually is. To my knowledge, it's only investigated on the second occurrence, and a lot of commanders just aren't reporting it. A lot of commanders going, well, he's gone anyway. Why would I bother with the paperwork when I'm actually fighting on the front line? Suggesting that more soldiers have deserted the Ukrainian army than are fighting men today in British, French and German army combined. Those who remain at the front, they're exhausted. Mobilised Ukrainian soldiers serve until the end of hostilities, meaning that some have been fighting continuously for 3.5 years. A draft law releasing military personnel from a service after 36 months was squashed by the government last year for fear that the retiring personnel could not be replaced. Again, the number one complaint I see from guys is you need to have a law of demobilisation. So if this war just continues for a decade, we are just on the front line. No men aged 18 to 60 have been allowed to leave the country since February 22 without special permission, or if they have enough money to get out. Since the Russian invasion, more than 6.8 million Ukrainians have fled the country, with a further 8 million internally displaced. Now, I believe the 6.8 million number, that is very, very low. It could be up to double that. And again, if that law of 18 to 60 gets lifted, we may see a huge immigration too. That's equivalent to 40% of its working age population. Runaway inflation is impoverishing ever larger swaths of the country. Today, 8.8 million people in Ukraine are living below the poverty line, up from 6 million the year before. Ukraine has demographic crises, but all of the demographers who release figures on this is what the population in Ukraine will look like, blah, 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 they are all skewing these figures. How are they skewing these figures? Because there's 8 million people internally displaced. There is millions of people who are in occupied Russian territories. All these demographers, they are assuming that Ukraine take back Crimea, take back Donetsk, take back Luhansk, take back all these areas, and all those people fall back under their population counts, as well as that all these people have left, including the men who will leave when the law gets lifted, that they all come back. And that number still looks catastrophic at that, regardless of how this war likely actually going to end with a line drawn somewhere. Last week, governments and businesses gathered in Rome for the 3rd annual Ukrainian Recovery Conference. The centrepiece of the conference was meant to be the unveiling of a multi-billion-dollar Ukraine recovery fund that US investment giant BlackRock has been working on since 22. But earlier this year, BlackRock announced that it was shuttering the fund due to a lack of interest. Germany's Friedrich Merz, Italia's Giorgia Meloni, and Poland's Donald Tusk were there to make the usual pledges of support. Yet in terms of concrete aid, the EU's were able to rustle up 2.3 billion, just a drop in the bucket compared to the World Bank estimate of 524 billion to restore Ukraine's infrastructure. Now, that number that I've seen is significantly lower than I've heard in other sectors. I've heard that it's well over $1 trillion for actual restoration of these areas. This is maybe right currently, so the damage that has been occurred right now would be this number, but if it was, the war was to push one or the other, that's going to increase dramatically and a lot, even down to just who's pouring the concrete here is going to take billions. I've heard the demining, I can't remember the number I quoted, but someone told me who was in like the knowledge of demining, said if you wanted to actually demine these areas properly, it's 100 years and hundreds of billions of dollars to do just the mining. Last slide for this. All of the political elite understand that Ukraine needs a new system of government to stabilise the situation, says a former Zelensky cabinet minister. People want to stop living in fear, but instead of asking how to help a transition of power in Ukraine, the EU is closing its eyes. Many of Zelensky's allies, including some of the country's top ministers, fear they could be prosecuted or exiled if they leave power. Zelensky's team have made many enemies in Ukraine's political class, explains a senior European diplomat who have attended the Rome conference. They fear that their future is exile or jail, which in turn only increases the temptation to line their pockets while they can. Or worse, you say exile or jail, okay? Or we've seen what has happened many times. You get labelled as a collaborator or a spy or this or that, and a certain service will make you go away. And like earlier in this article, the Putinification of politics that is coming from internally as well. Trump's newly announced Patriot package is welcome news. So are Europe's continued promises of unwavering support, rhetoric versus reality of Europe. But none of Ukraine's allies can really help the country's chronic manpower shortage or with the deepening crisis of legitimacy that Zelensky faces. No. The West cannot fix manpower. They cannot fix legitimacy of Zelensky. It doesn't matter what is delivered. And the manpower is the number one tactical issue that's being ignored. Patriot will not fix that at all. You could deliver 1,000 Patriot systems, 1,000 batteries. And if you're on the front line, you're not going to notice. It increases the cost of the war for Russia, absolutely. But it is a defense, it's called air defense for a reason. Most worrying of all, no outsiders can reverse the spiral of arrests or of former regime loyalists, crack down on opposition members and shut down of media outlets that are doing so much to erode Ukraine's faith in the war effort and in Zelensky's leadership. This I disagree with. Yes, they can. Outsiders can. Ukraine is completely reliant on Western money, aid, everything, from salaries to weapons. And if the EU, America, whoever, actually was like, hey, look, the shutdown of this media outlet from a YouTube channel to a free-to-air network or this or that, that's bullshit, it could absolutely shift that. But do they want to is also the question. Now, this is my conclusion to this article. I was going to do this first, but let's have a look over this. YouTubers, media, the EU, they've all been telling us that everything is fine for years and that Russia has been defeated. What has happened to that? This is what happens when you focus on optics and how things are seen over correct tactical, strategic, frontline warfighting decisions. What happens is the attritional nature of bankruptcy that eventually comes, and then it's like, what the fuck? It's everything at once. That it seems fine until, hang on, no one believes this or the front line's moving. It all comes at once. You don't lose your house, your wife, your kids and your car overnight from gambling. You lose little by little and we will start to see much, much more of this as this continues. And then what we'll see is a lot of buck passing. So we'll see media, bloggers, whoever, buck pass onto it's this fault, that fault, whatever. From Trump to me, I guess, we'll get buck pass to that. And what they'll do is they'll create a pseudo environment of use an informational warfare to set up an environment of which that is correct, but not show you all the factors. So they'll say, the pseudo environment that we set is because Trump didn't deliver another $150 billion, Ukraine had to have some concession. Now, in that, is there a lie in that? Not really. It might be bending the truth a little bit, but it's leaving out all these other things of like, well, no, there's manpower issues, there's legitimacy crisis, all that. But we're starting to see this pseudo environment of exception of concession start to be set up and buck pass. And it won't talk about the reality of attritional war. And this optics driven that we've seen is what I always say about propaganda needs to support military actions, not the other way around. Now, before we get into the last bit of it, I need to read number 1 to 4. And this is from Mr. Tatarigami UA. You've probably seen this before. He's spoken about propaganda is a double-edged sword. And eventually it started working against Ukraine after initial success and making reflection harder and not bringing eyes to deterioration. It became obvious that propaganda was getting people killed. I believe people on this website have blood on their hands who know better but weren't prepared to call it out. Essentially, propaganda started to cover leadership mistakes, making them feel a lack of accountability for their decisions. No matter what, the mantra was the same. Trust the armed forces of Ukraine. Again from himself. Instead of self-reflection or an honest assessment of what went wrong, Ukrainian leadership largely blamed the West. And we'll see more of this in that buck pass. To be clear, the West didn't do enough. It was too slow and provided too little. But Ukraine had its own deep-rooted issues that no one talked about. And anyone trying to raise the problems was quickly labelled as a Russian agent, an FSB PSYOP, a shill, or whatever other label to discredit them. Absolutely. I've had all of that. So has he. Once again, instead of self-reflection, the narrative shifted to declaring Ukraine's counteroffensive a victory because the Black Sea Fleet had been crippled. To this day, I fail to see how naval operations and land operations are even connected. Again and again, instead of addressing internal issues, Ukraine and its pro-Ukrainian community not only suppressed criticism, but allowed the situation within the Ukrainian army to deteriorate further. By the end of 24, this led to a full-blown crisis suddenly. And that's what we've spoken about. You eventually pay the piper. You can ignore, but eventually you pay the piper and you have a crisis immediately. Many of us can see this occurring. Many are starting to see it now once it's crossed that event horizon. Ukraine was facing severe manpower shortages, mobilisation struggles and skyrocketing AWOL numbers. The case of the 155th even became an international scandal. Of course, everyone walking away. It also became clear that these problems weren't isolated incidents, but the result of a deep systemic failures that would require radical reforms and monumental efforts to fix. But you weren't allowed to bring up reforms or efforts or talk about these changes that needed to take place. Otherwise, you were labelled an agent. You had the best intentions. When people aren't gradually introduced to these issues, when they have to understand the battlefield through propaganda narratives, they swing quick from blind optimism to extreme pessimism, losing morale and faith entirely. So when you have been fed what is occurring only through a propaganda narrative, eventually that's going to swing the pendulum very quickly. We'll see that. Now in 25, it's obviously too late to make changes that could win the war, but they are still absolutely necessary if Ukraine is to continue fighting until Russia reaches the point of exhaustion. And to be clear, this isn't about pushing Ukraine back to 2014 or even 22. It's about ensuring Russia fails to achieve its strategic objectives in Ukraine and just gives up. So if we make these changes, no, we're not regaining this ground, but we make it so costly that they will just give up. And that is where optics drives some poor decisions, because the optics is we need to recover, hold. The correct decisions is to attrit. And people saying that that's happening, if the goal is attrit, it doesn't look like these envelopments in here and soldiers complaining of that we're being told at all cost, do not withdraw. And this is an example of just this optics over anything. This is a professor of economics living in Cleveland, Ohio. So he's not Ukraine, but Roman Sheremetyev. It's Russia with a lowercase, not Russia with an uppercase. And that Ukraine's National Commission of State Language Standards has ruled that writing Russia in lowercase letters is no longer an error. Thank you for single-handedly winning the fucking war. I'm sure the boys on the front line who don't have ammo or enough men beside them give a fuck about fucking grammar and spelling, mate. But again, we see so much focus put into bullshit like that rather than what is the correct decision, maybe not optically. So let's actually get into more of the conclusion here. That this is how attritional warfare works. It's very simple to understand, but people won't apply it because it doesn't fit their narrative or audience capture or what they have as their internal bias. That it's not about speed, it's about bleeding. Russia is not aiming for quick breakthroughs. It is applying constant grinding pressure everywhere, diplomatically, politically, militarily, internationally as well, even domestically, to wear down Ukraine through losses in men, morale, material. Putin believes, and his commanders believe, that Ukraine is on the brink of collapse. And as you'll hear me say, they smell blood in the water, and is happy to let time and stress do the work. And what we have seen is, the beginning years, everyone said time is on Ukraine's side. We all said, it doesn't seem that way. Now we're hearing from Karen Callas to Ursula von der continue lying, continue saying, Putin's trying to extend the war. Yes, because it makes strategic sense. I don't want him to extend the war, increasing suffering. But does it make strategic sense objectively to extend the war and let time and stress do the work? Yeah, and that's why these ultimatums and defensive is you pile it up and let it fall down. I forgot who said that. Someone said that about the Soviets in World War II. It was a German officer. If someone could write in the comments, because it's going to annoy me all day. There was a German officer who said they piled it up against us and let it fall down. Number 2, Ukraine's burden increases over time because they're a numerically inferior force. They don't have the numbers. Ukraine is forced to defend everywhere, constantly with less manpower and a declining morale. Russia can exploit this through targeted strikes, long-range attacks, the triple choke method, the paint by numbers, and has air dominance in most areas. Air dominance does not mean superiority. Again, if you were to have this as you've got complete superiority and nothing over here, you're a lot more dominant in the air. The Su-34s operate as if they've got superiority. They can drop a bomb anywhere they want. And they know that Ukraine can't rotate exhausted troops. That's why they're using the triple choke to hold them in place. And this is from basically doctrine of attritional protracted war. Offensive, you launch across a broad front, you overwhelm the enemy at multiple points using shallow attacks. Exactly what we have said in this, as far as you're forced to defend everywhere. Your intent is to remain inside a bubble of friendly protective systems, drones, blah, blah, blah. You stretch depleted enemy reserves until the front line eventually collapses. Then there's a cascading effect, which a crisis in one sector forces defenders to shift reserves from another sector to only generate a crisis there in turn. And Russia is helping facilitate this. So they will push in Sumy. Ukraine has to move from Pokrovsk to Sumy. Oh, fuck. Generates a crisis here, move troops back down, and then they'll push in Sumy and generate a crisis there. It's that cat and mouse. But this is the problem with fighting an enemy who has much, much larger numbers and a lot more higher morale in many areas as well. And the more weapons to bring into fold for fires too. As forces start falling back and leaving prepared fortifications, morale plummets with the obvious question, if we can't hold the mega fortress, how can we hold these new trenches? Retreat then turns into rout and falling, and that's why we say the extra chromosomal people that believe in constant or linear rate of movement for attritional warfare should be fucking called out for it, because it's a ridiculous nature. And we see, I actually believe that when we saw that moving and that, holy shit, if we can't hold this, what about this? I think Avdiivka was actually one of those. Now, the goal is to force the enemy to expend vital material and strategic reserves on strategically meaningless operations. Pokrovsk is not strategically meaningless. But what the strategically meaningless operation is, you want to hold this area to have attrition. You're expending materials. The key pitfall is to avoid being dragged into the very same trap that's been set for the enemy. And this is the trap Ukraine should be setting for Russia, back. But the front line in these envelopments doesn't show that. And the very same trap that has been set is exactly what we spoke about in Kursk, that you're going for strategically meaningless areas, but you're expending massive amounts of vital material and strategic reserves. And in that case, your best soldiers and weapon systems too. Further, 3, the internal collapse is the goal. Russia's goal has never been a territorial figure or the X or Y or whatever. It's always been to ruin Ukrainian potential. And that potential is the potential to join NATO, the potential to join the EU, the potential to stand on their own, their potential to fight back Russia. That has always been the goal. I don't care what it's stated about we want X village. No, the goal's always been that potential. And then you use war as a tool of politics, a blunt force trauma tool, a savage tool. But if it's one that works, it works. And in Russia's case, it was the only one that worked. That diplomatically, politically, whatever, going to the UN, nothing worked. So they said, fuck, we're doing a blunt force tool of war. That doesn't mean we can justify that. But what we're saying is they're using war as a tool of politics to destroy potential here. And that attritional warfare, this works by creating a chaos of internal dysfunction. It exacerbates corruption, desertion, collapses morale, and infighting is as valuable or more valuable to Russia as battlefield victories. I would say more valuable. Crisis of legitimacy in Zelensky's government is now arguably more dangerous than Russian advances. You'd rather you lose Pokrovsk than have this internal dysfunction occurring. And anyone who raises legitimate concerns is labelled as a shill, an agent, whatever, like Mr. Tataragami Yue spoke of, even if you're a believer like myself in that sunlight is the best disinfectant. You're trying to bring these issues first of all, go, hey, look, this isn't, what the fuck? This guy stole $40 million that was meant to be mortar shells? Bring that up and no, you're working against us and you're an enemy of the state. And as per that tranny said, that we will hunt you wherever you lie. That, number 4, authoritarian drift weakens war effort. The trust and unity are critical in total war. The erosion of democracy, media suppression, and elite self-preservation, they undermine cohesion and ability on the front line. And that you don't slip into authoritarianism by revolution, you slip into it through an erosion of democracy. Just like in many other protracted wars, when the population loses faith in the war's purpose and their leadership, the collapse can come quickly and from within. As I said, the goal is to rot internally. The goal isn't to win quickly, it's to make your enemy rot from the inside out. And that's what attritional warfare, it's why if you want to seize and hold terrain, attritional is more costly than manoeuvre, but by killing everything from potential to men to machine to plants on the ground, there's nothing left. And Ukraine is now showing true signs of what attritional warfare does to a country. After years of non-stop fighting, the army and its people are exhausted, desertions are skyrocketing, and there's simply no manpower to rotate. And that those men who are left, they are less and less inclined and motivated to sign up. Question being asked should be, if you didn't sign up when Ukraine was winning, why would you sign up when they're losing? And even if you get dragged off the street, what is your real motivation to fight and die? And we see that morale is breaking, and not just from battlefield losses, but from a government that is seen as corrupt and willing to silence opposition, both in the media, politically, and kidnap you off the street, with opposing voices, often with good intentions, threatened and silenced. And we'll say, opposing voices with good intentions are being threatened and silenced. Inflation is surging, millions have fled, with many who will not return, and foreign investors are starting to walk away. And as I've said, and I've said before, Ukraine is first and foremost its people, then the culture they carry, and only after that, the land, the territory. You cannot gamble the future of a nation on territorial goals, no matter how unjust the circumstances. And this is how attritional warfare works, not with sudden breakthroughs, but by bleeding a country dry. You bleed them white, grinding down its will to fight. You break the institutions and letting internal collapse do the work. You pile it up and let the cards fall down. But only if we could have seen this coming. Really, no one ever saw this. What about this article from Rand, Extending Russia? It's 100 and something pages, and I think you should go and read through it. Or if you're very lazy, I guess you could copy the whole thing into, what's it called, an AI thing and just go summarise. But have a look through. And at least at this, go to page 128 of the 354 and have a look at the risks and the conclusions that are drawn. That, oh, did I cut out? Oh, sorry, I think I actually cut out one of these, but that's all right. That an increase in US assistance to Ukraine would likely lead to commensurate increases in both Russian aid to the separatists and Russian military forces in Ukraine, thus sustain the conflict at a somewhat higher level of intensity. You don't say. Alternatively, Russia might counter-escalate, committing more troops and pushing them deeper into Ukraine. Russia might even preempt US action, escalating before any additional US aid arrives. What we saw. Such escalation might extend to Russia. Eastern Ukraine is already a drain. Russia's going to have to put in a lot. Taking more of Ukraine might only increase the burden, albeit at the expense of the Ukrainian people. So by extending Russia to create a drain of resources, it might increase the burden, But who's it at the expense of? As they point out, the Ukrainian people. However, such a move might also come at a significant cost to Ukraine and to US prestige and credibility. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace. Some analysts maintain that Russia lacks the resources to escalate the conflict. This gentleman here says war is expensive, falling oil prices, economic decline, sanctions and campaigning in Syria are likely to continue through 2016, leave little room for a large-scale military manoeuvre by Russia. And they can't afford this. Now, in the next paragraph beyond this, they say this is a very optimistic view of trying to create a drain. You create a high-pressure hose. Likelihood of success. Eastern Ukraine is already a significant drain on Russian resources, exacerbated by the accompanying Western sanctions. Increasing US military aid would certainly drive up the Russian costs, but doing so could also increase the loss of Ukrainian lives and territory or result in a disadvantageous peace settlement. This would generally be seen as a serious setback for US policy. US international credibility. I don't know if it's ever been lower. Ukraine isn't, in the West, credibility and support for Ukraine, yeah, whatever. It doesn't really reduce US power. The big ones is support of Israel in the Middle East. Whether you agree or disagree with that, the credibility of the US rules-based order, whatever you want to say, has been just blown out of the water over the past 18 months, and adherence to laws on conflict, all of the ICC, whatever you want to say. And then the second one is the island that's going on at the moment. Forget the Kinzhashivki island boys. The legitimate pedo island that the US elites from both sides of the aisle, red or blue, from Hollywood to Silicon Valley, are covering up. That are covering it up. How do you look at that? And I've thought about this, and poor Lily, I've chewed her ear off in the car. It was a 10-hour 40 drive yesterday, but it took me 12 hours to stop, and I chewed her ear off about it the whole time. That if I was Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister at the moment, of course Australia's closest ally is America. But what do I think of the administration right now? Like, what if I was the Prime Minister going, okay, yeah, I have to do this deal and this and that, but they had a pedo island, man, that they've covered up. And we scream about these cluster weapons being used, but then we see this. We've been dragged in, like, huge problem. Sorry, we've got way off in the weeds here. But if Ukraine have a disadvantageous peace settlement, it will be seen as a serious setback. And what Trump doesn't want is a mark on his name for another disadvantageous ending to a war, like recent wars have had. And the reason... Sorry, that was Netflix charging me for the month. Sorry, that was my phone vibrating. The reason the US has lost a lot of wars recently is because I don't think they were actually willing to pour in the assets and resources and loss that it takes, because you want to fight an insurgency in a way of maneuver rather than attrition. And by the reason attrition can be successful is everything gets taken. There's no one left to resist, and that's why maneuver and problem. And that's why Russia may have success with something like this, is you've got that European discipline and Asian tyranny, as what's-his-face Kissinger will say. Anyway, conclusion. The option of expanding US military aid to Ukraine has to be evaluated principally on whether doing so could help end the conflict in the Donbass on acceptable terms, rather simply on costs it imposes on Moscow. So, is it acceptable, or are we only doing this for increasing the cost on Moscow? Exactly what I've said here. Ukraine is first and foremost its people, then the culture they carry, and only after that the land. You cannot gamble the future of a nation on territorial goals, no matter how unjust the circumstances. And you can't gamble the future of a people on trying to increase cost on a country of which you do not like. And why don't you like them? Well, it can go back historically, as well as a hell of a lot of information too. Boosting US aid is part of a broader diplomatic strategy to advance the settlement it might well make sense, but calibrating the level of assistance to produce the desired effect while avoiding a damaging counter-escalation could be challenging. I'll say that it was. Legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day. Sorry we got off in the weeds. I apologise for that. Why is Netflix now $26 a month? My Lord. Look after yourselves. I hope you're doing well. And I will speak to you tomorrow over the next days. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.